There comes a time in the life of almost every deeply caring person when they begin to wonder about their own nature. They ask themselves why their openness seems to make them vulnerable, why their sensitivity feels like a weight, why their ability to care so deeply often leaves them feeling unsteady. If you have ever found yourself asking questions like these, know that you're not alone. Many empaths carry this quiet uncertainty, believing that their greatest gift is also their greatest weakness. It is so easy to fall into this belief. We live in a world that often praises strength in its louder, more visible forms. Assertiveness is admired. Power is equated with control. Voices that dominate are often mistaken for voices that matter most. In comparison, sensitivity can feel small, quiet, and overlooked. It can feel like something that sets you apart in a way that is not always celebrated. And when you experience moments where others seem to take advantage of your openness, the message grows stronger. You begin to think that maybe your empathy really is a liability. But what if that belief is not the truth? What if the very thing you doubt most about yourself is actually your deepest strength? What if the reason you have felt vulnerable is not because your empathy is weak, but because it is powerful in ways you have not yet fully recognized? There is something that those who rely on control and manipulation quietly know. Something they do not say out loud, but something that guides their behavior all the same. And it is this: they fear being seen. They fear being understood at a level they cannot control. They fear the quiet clarity of an empath who can notice what others dismiss, who can sense the gap between what is presented and what is real. And that is why empaths often feel so targeted, so diminished, so unsettled in the presence of those who rely on masks. It is because their very presence threatens what is false. This is the secret that many empaths are never told. The secret that your empathy, far from being fragile, carries a strength that unsettles those who depend on control. You may not even realize how deeply you sense truth until you look back on your experiences. Perhaps you have noticed moments when something felt off, even if no one else seemed to see it. Perhaps you have been told you're too sensitive, only to later realize that your sensitivity was pointing you toward something real. These are not coincidences. They are the quiet demonstrations of the power you carry. The reason this secret is so often hidden from you is because when you doubt yourself, you stop trusting this awareness. When you question your own strength, you stop seeing clearly. When you overgive, when you silence your intuition, when you diminish your own needs, the mirror of empathy becomes fogged. And that is exactly what those who rely on control want. They want you to believe you are powerless, when in truth, your empathy is the one thing that reveals what they cannot hide. But you are here now, and that means something. It means you're ready to begin seeing your sensitivity in a new way. It means you're willing to question the story that empathy is weakness. It means you are open to the possibility that your gift has always been your strength, even when you could not see it clearly. Chapter 1. The Hidden Power of Empathy. To truly understand the secret, we first need to pause and look closely at what empathy really is. Because so often, the word itself is misunderstood. It is spoken of as kindness, as compassion, as caring for others. And while all of those are part of it, empathy runs much deeper than that. Empathy is not only about giving, it is about perceiving. It is about feeling into the unspoken and sensing the layers of reality that exist beneath the surface of words and appearances. Think of the times when you have walked into a room and felt the atmosphere before anyone said a word. Perhaps it was a heaviness in the air, or a lightness that made you feel at ease, or a tension that was invisible yet undeniable. That is empathy. It is not something you force or something you consciously seek out. It is simply there, as natural as breathing. Think of the times when you listened to someone tell a story and you noticed what they left unsaid. You heard the words, but you also felt the pauses, the hesitations, the moments where their voice betrayed something they were not naming. You may not have fully understood it in that moment, but something in you sensed that there was more than what was being spoken. That, too, is empathy. It is a deeper awareness that goes beyond the surface. And yet, because it is quiet, empathy is so often mistaken for fragility. The world tends to value what is visible, what is loud, what demands attention. But empathy does not demand. It notices, it softens, it receives. And so people sometimes believe that it is passive, that it has no real power. But that belief could not be further from the truth. Softness is not weakness. In fact, it often carries a strength that force can never hold. A soft voice can reach where shouting cannot. A gentle touch can soothe where harshness only wounds. And a caring presence can disarm the strongest defenses, not by overpowering them, but by quietly cutting through them. This is the hidden power of empathy. It works not through force, but through truth. Empathy is like a mirror, reflecting what is real, whether someone wants it reflected or not. It is the ability to stand in presence and quietly reveal what lies beneath. That is why it is so powerful, and that is why it is so often misunderstood. Because power is usually defined as the ability to control. But empathy's power is the ability to see, and what can be seen cannot be so easily controlled. If you have ever doubted yourself because of your sensitivity, I want you to pause and really take this in. The very thing you thought made you weak is what makes you strong. Your ability to notice, to sense, to feel deeply gives you clarity. And clarity is one of the greatest sources of strength there is. When you begin to understand this, something inside of you shifts. You stop apologizing for being sensitive. You stop trying to harden yourself to match a world that often values hardness. You begin instead to honor what you carry. You begin to realize that your empathy allows you to move through life with an awareness that others may not even know is possible. And that awareness is not small. It is not fragile. It is powerful in ways that many people cannot fully grasp. It is powerful in ways that those who rely on control find deeply unsettling. Because if you can see clearly, if you can sense what is hidden, then their masks no longer work. Their games no longer hold the same weight. Their control begins to falter. This is why understanding the hidden power of empathy is so important. Because the moment you begin to see it not as a weakness, but as a strength, you change the way you carry yourself. You stand taller, even if only inside. You trust yourself more deeply. You no longer shrink in the presence of force. And in doing so, you begin to step into the strength that was always yours. As we move into the next chapter, we will look more closely at what those who depend on control truly fear, and why your empathy shines a light they cannot easily withstand. But before we do, hold on to this truth. Your empathy is not the problem. It is not what leaves you vulnerable. It is what makes you strong in ways you may have never been told before. Chapter 2. What narcissists truly fear. Now that we have uncovered the hidden power of empathy, we can begin to see why it can feel so unsettling to those who depend on masks and control. And this brings us to the secret they do not want you to know. The truth is, what they fear most is not confrontation. It is not being shouted at. It is not being challenged by arguments or force. What they fear most is being seen. You see, those who rely on control spend a great deal of energy creating an image. They build layers of presentation carefully crafted so others will view them in a certain way. It might look like charm. It might look like authority. It might look like confidence. But behind the appearance, there is often a gap between how they want to be seen and what is actually real. And while many people may overlook that gap, empaths rarely do. An empath's gift is noticing. You may not always be able to explain it in words, but you feel when something does not align. You feel when the words sound right, but the tone is slightly off. You sense when the actions do not quite match the promises. You notice the tiny inconsistencies that most people dismiss. And this noticing creates a kind of quiet mirror. A mirror that reflects back the truth no matter how carefully it has been hidden. And this is exactly what unsettles those who depend on hiding. Because when you see clearly, you cannot be as easily controlled. You cannot be as easily swayed by charm or surface appearances. You may not always call it out directly, but your presence alone carries a truth they cannot fully escape. And for those who live behind a mask, that is deeply uncomfortable. This is the part empaths often miss. Because when they feel drained in these encounters, they assume it is because they are powerless. They assume they are being pulled under because they lack strength. But in reality, the exhaustion often comes from the opposite. It comes from the empath's strength, pressing quietly against the mask. It comes from the tension of someone else feeling exposed in ways they do not want to be. And that tension is directed back at the empath, leaving them feeling unsteady without realizing that it was their clarity that created the discomfort in the first place. Those who rely on control fear empathy because empathy cannot be fooled. It does not rely on surface appearances. It does not stop at what is spoken. It goes deeper, and in doing so, it strips away the illusions that give them their sense of power. They may try to diminish the empath. They may attempt to make the empath doubt themselves. They may use words like too sensitive or too emotional to cloud the mirror. But the truth is that those words are not reflections of the empath's weakness. They are reflections of someone else's fear of being revealed. Think about that for a moment. The very qualities you have questioned in yourself are the qualities that quietly create fear in those who depend on deception. That is not weakness. That is power. And once you begin to understand this, the way you see yourself begins to change. You stop viewing your sensitivity as a liability. You begin to see it as the very thing that makes you resilient, the very thing that protects you, the very thing that reveals what cannot be hidden. And this is the secret they hope you never discover. Because once you do, the dynamic shifts. Once you know that your empathy unsettles those who rely on control, you stop doubting your instincts. You stop shrinking. You begin to trust that what you sense is real, and that trust becomes a shield no mask can penetrate. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore how empaths can sometimes lose sight of this strength. Because even with this power, it is easy to fall into self-doubt, to overgive, and to forget what is true. But remember this as we continue, what others fear most about your empathy is not your silence, not your words, not even your care. What they fear most is that you can see them clearly, and that is a strength you carry whether you realize it or not. Chapter 3. How Empaths Lose Sight of Their Strength. If empathy holds so much quiet power, then why does it so often feel like the opposite? Why do so many empaths feel drained, small, or even powerless in situations where they should feel strong? The answer lies not in the absence of strength, but in the way empaths often lose sight of their own power. Empaths are deeply attuned to the needs of others. From an early age, many learn to read the subtle shifts in tone, in body language, in the spaces between words. They notice the feelings in a room before anyone else does. And because they are so aware of these things, they often begin to adapt themselves in response. If someone else feels tense, the empath softens. If someone else is upset, the empath calms. If someone else is uncertain, the empath reassures. This ability to adjust is beautiful in many ways. It creates harmony. It makes others feel understood. It allows empaths to be a steady presence in the lives of those around them. But over time, something begins to happen. The empath's attention shifts more and more outward until their own needs and feelings become background noise. They learn to focus so intently on others that they forget to focus on themselves. When this happens, the balance tips. Empathy, instead of being a source of clarity, becomes a source of exhaustion. Because when you give endlessly without replenishing, your inner well runs dry. And when you are exhausted, doubt begins to creep in. You start to wonder if what you sense is really true. You begin to question whether you're simply imagining things. You tell yourself you're too sensitive, and the mirror of empathy, which once reflected reality with such clarity, begins to fog over. It is not that your ability has disappeared. It is still there, but it becomes buried under layers of fatigue and self-doubt. And this is often the moment when empaths feel most powerless, not because they lack strength, but because they have forgotten that their strength even exists. This forgetting is made heavier by the words of others. When empaths are told they are overreacting or too emotional, it reinforces the doubt. When their deep perceptions are dismissed, they start to believe the dismissal, and slowly the voice of intuition becomes quieter, while the voice of doubt grows louder. But here is the truth. That clarity never leaves you. It is always within you, even in the moments when you cannot feel it. It waits patiently beneath the surface, ready to return the moment you choose to honor it again. You may lose sight of your strength, but you never lose the strength itself. Losing sight of your strength is not a failure. It is part of the journey, because empathy is not just about sensing others. It is also about learning to turn that sensitivity inward. It is about noticing when you're overextended, when your boundaries have thinned, when you're carrying more than you were meant to carry. And this turning inward is often the hardest step for empaths to take because they are so used to focusing outward. But this step is where the shift begins. This is where you start to remember. When you pause long enough to ask yourself, how do I feel in this moment? What do I need? What truth am I sensing that I have been dismissing? In those questions, the fog begins to clear. The mirror begins to shine again. And you begin to step back into the quiet strength that was always yours. Remember, losing sight of your strength does not mean you have lost it. It only means you are being called to remember it. And remembering is always possible. Chapter 4. Reclaiming your inner power. Reclaiming your strength as an empath begins with a quiet decision. It is the decision to no longer see your sensitivity as something that needs to be explained away or diminished, but as something that deserves to be honored. This is not a loud or dramatic shift. It is gentle, steady, and deeply personal. It begins when you pause and remind yourself that what you sense is real, that your feelings matter, and that the way you move through the world holds value. The first step is awareness. Awareness that your empathy is not weakness. Awareness that the heaviness you sometimes feel after certain interactions is not a sign of fragility, but a sign that you have taken in too much without giving yourself space to release it. Awareness that the exhaustion you carry is not proof that you're powerless, but proof that you have been giving endlessly without protecting your own well-being. When you see this clearly, you begin to shift the story you tell yourself. And that story matters because the way you speak to yourself is the foundation of the way you carry your power. The next step is boundaries. For many empaths, boundaries can feel uncomfortable, almost like they are walls keeping people out. But boundaries are not walls. They are doors. And doors can be opened and closed with intention. Boundaries are simply the choices that keep you whole. They are the pause you take before saying yes to something that will leave you drained. They are the gentle words you use when you realize you need more time, more rest, or more space. They are the quiet reminders that your well-being matters just as much as anyone else's. Boundaries are not about shutting down your empathy. They're about protecting it so it remains clear and steady rather than clouded and depleted. When you honor your limits, you give your empathy room to breathe. You allow it to remain the gift it was always meant to be. Reclaiming your inner power also means trusting your intuition. Trusting those small nudges that tell you something does not feel right, even if you cannot explain why. Trusting the unease you sense beneath polished words. Trusting the comfort you feel in the presence of authenticity. For too long, empaths have been taught to doubt themselves, to believe that sensitivity is something to question. But when you begin to trust your perceptions again, your power grows stronger. Because truth does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And the gift of empathy is hearing that whisper when others cannot. Another way to reclaim your power is through stillness. So often, empaths feel the need to explain, to soothe, to make peace. But stillness can be just as powerful as action. Sometimes you do not need to say a word. Sometimes simply knowing the truth and holding it within you is enough. Those who rely on control may push, may provoke, may attempt to shake your ground. But your quiet awareness, your calm steadiness, can unsettle them far more than any argument ever could. And finally, reclaiming your inner power means balance. Empathy is a gift that shines brightest when it is nourished, not drained. When you give to others while also giving to yourself, your empathy remains clear, steady, and strong. Balance might look like rest after a long day of listening. It might look like creative expression that allows you to release what you have absorbed. It might look like time alone to reset, or time with people who uplift you and remind you of your own worth. Reclaiming your power is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering who you have always been. It is about seeing your sensitivity not as something to fix, but as something to protect. It is about choosing to stand in your truth with quiet confidence, knowing that your empathy is your strength. Your journey as an empath is not about becoming less sensitive. It is about becoming more aware of how powerful your sensitivity truly is. It is about honoring your energy so it is not drained. It is about setting boundaries so your empathy remains clear. It is about trusting your intuition even when the world tells you to doubt. And it is about living in balance, where your care for others is matched by care for yourself.